on that lecture and the discussion that occurred. Ibrahima was gracious enough to send me the recorded version of the lecture, which I have uploaded to my personal YouTube channel. So if you weren't here last week and you'd like to spend an hour and a half listening to what we talked about, you can go to YouTube, type in my name in the search line, my full name, Edward Dodson, and my channel will come up, and it's the first video that's available there. So here we are in week 2. And last week we had some robust discussion, in particular about gross domestic product and what it means. And we're not going to cover that ground again, but it is just an example, I think, of how controversial is the interpretation of statistics and data and what it's telling us about where we are in the economic cycle and what's happening in our economy. And there's today, what's happening today is really interesting in that regard, because there's great debate. Are we in a recession? What's the definition of being in a recession? I sent to Ibrahima an article that appeared today on the website of the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER. This is a conservative research organization that was founded by Edward C. Harwood back in the 1930s. And for most of their history, they were very much a gold standard supporting entity with some interest in Henry George's ideas. In fact, Edward Harwood served on the board of trustees of the Henry George School for some years. But in recent decades, they've become more and more, I would say, somewhere between libertarian and conservative in their orientation. But this is a really good article on the current state of the economy and the recession. So I'm urging Ibrahima to make it available to you, all of you. But you can go to their website, AIER's website, and you can find it as well. Okay, so last week, and again, I want this to be as interactive as you care to make it. We're going to skip all over subjects, so I don't want to lecture for a half an hour or 45 minutes and then for you to jump in with questions, because we'll have gone past different subjects and different topics. So put your yellow hand up if you want to make a comment or ask a question. There's a lot of material in this course based on the time it took to get through the first 25 slides last week. You can see there's 327 slides in this course. So I'm pretty sure that we're not going to make it in 4 or 5 weeks. And so if you're willing to, I'll be willing to come back in September for at least 2 weeks in September to try to finish up. Okay, so where do we leave off? Well, this is the last slide that I showed you. And, it just really showed one leading indicator of what's happening in the economy is what's happening to mortgage originations. And this is something I followed, religiously every month in my working environment. And so what's happening now, of course, interest rates are increasing. So that means mortgage interest rates are increasing. That will inevitably lead to a decline in mortgage refinancings. People who have a 3% mortgage aren't going to refinance. And there aren't very many people left with existing mortgage interest rates that are higher than what the current rate is. So that's going to lead to a significant drop off in mortgage origination volume. And that's going to follow all through the economy, because there's money to be made by a lot of different players as loans are refinanced. And so we're going to see some impact, I think, of the decline in refinances over the next, couple years. So we'll find out how quickly that's going to manifest into changes in the in the overall picture of the economy. Okay, this next graph here. Hang on a second. Get to catch up. Okay. This looks at crude oil prices. And going back to 2008, when we were in a significant contraction, crude oil prices obviously went down as a result of decline in demand, and supplies remained relatively constant. So there's a dramatic drop in prices of a barrel of oil until the economy starts to recover, until employment starts to recover and demand increases. I just looked at the prices today, and they're down, depending upon the quality of crude oil, they're down to $91 to $98 after the recent spike up. So thinking again about where we are in a cycle, here's a look at crude oil prices as they went up and down since the last crash. So you see the deep decline, and then prices go back up, and then we hit 2014 and prices fell again. Why did they fall? Well, largely because the market producers had produced and got back up. There are new oil sources tapped, and things like the tar sands in Canada, all of that increased supply. Keith, you have a comment or question? You have to unmute yourself, my man. Or maybe you don't want to say anything. Okay, let me continue then. My computer is reacting slowly tonight. Okay, so here again, looking at crude oil prices, they began to rise early in 2020, climbed $100 in March of 2022, and then the price peaked at $115 a barrel. Today, it's, as I said, between $91 and $98 a barrel, depending upon the type of crude oil that is being purchased. Some of it, highly has to be refined more significantly than others, and some of you may know more about that process than I've ever tried to learn. But this is a picture of what I see as our situation today. I don't know about you, but I've noticed no reduction in the number of automobiles and trucks on the roadways because of the high cost of gasoline or diesel fuel. And it's pretty clear that reducing fuel consumption for many working people is difficult, maybe even impossible, because we're so dependent upon the automobile for transportation to work, for shopping, for all of our other daily activities. And in parts of the United States, there is almost no public transit system. It's hard to believe, but in the city of Arlington, Texas, which has 400,000 people, there's no bus service. And there are a number of other cities across the United States with over 100,000 people who have no public transit systems. So in those parts of the economy of the country, they are totally locked into a fossil fuel, gasoline, automobile environment. How do they make changes in the short run? If gasoline prices go up again, those households are obviously, unless their incomes are going up, those households are obviously having to make decisions about cutting back on spending or digging into their savings. All of which, if you're at the 50% below of area median income and median household net worth, you're starting to feel the crunch, even if you're employed full time. So this is part of where we are right now, and what government policy is having to take in consideration. Okay. Then there's this part of what we're engaging in. a lot of people since the pandemic have been working at home. And while working at home saves money that would be spent on driving, there's also the expenses for air conditioning in the summer and heating in the winter, and just a general increase in the use of electricity. So those are significant offsets to the savings of working from home. And I just ask, for those of you who are spending more time at home, what's happened to your own monthly utility bills and other expenses? Anybody, care to own up to what's happening to you personally? I'd love to hear that. I don't see anyone's. Rio, is that how you pronounce your name?
Oh, yeah. Good evening and good morning. I'm down here from Melbourne.
You're in Melbourne.
Yes.
Oh, great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for letting me join this one. Yeah, so now I think Keith wanted to probably make a comment after that. Now we are allowed to be unmuted. Can I just get back a little bit? I had a bit of comment of the oil prices, yeah, regarding the oil prices. So the current one, yeah, sitting around 90. Do you think any, so probably more of a question, do you think the shutting down the Keystone pipeline and getting the United States, from energy independent, totally shutting down, that has a effect on those?
Well, when some supply sources are shut down, that gives an incentive for other producers to increase the supply to a point. But of course, as I mentioned last week, for example, the Saudis may not want to increase their production in order to increase supply unless there's a political reason for doing it. And also, I mentioned that, you have oil producers that have other investment interests. And so the highest price for a barrel of oil may not be the most desirable price for them to experience the greatest net return on all of their investment activity. So we have all these players making decisions, some of which are political, some of which are economic. And then there's just an enormous pressure to try to move to sustainable energy as quickly as possible. So I don't have any crystal ball on that, but maybe someone else, if anyone works in the fossil fuels industry, share your thoughts.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, thank you. And just a quick one on this one. Yes, it did have a impact on my utility spending, yes, just as shown here, as I did sign up for a faster wider bandwidth to get the work done at home. So I am spending a bit more on the internet as well.
So what you saved on not driving to work, you're spending on more computer power.
That's right. And also heating up my home, which is very cold here in Melbourne. So, and the houses are not insulated very well. So I'm spending a lot more on my gas.
Sure. So, and people who are in that same situation and expect that will be a long-term situation may be spending money to retrofit their house. I mean, how many you probably see every night on television, somebody comes on and says, I can insulate your house, to keep the hot air and hot air out when it's hot and the cold air in when it's when you need it. So there's money to be spent, and that's going to stimulate the economy in some respects too.
Oh, Wayne. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm retired, so but I have a 1,600 square foot well-insulated house with a large array of solar panels on my roof. And even in the summertime here in the Central California Central Valley, my electricity bill is around $50 a month.
And did you get a tax credit?
I did when I put it in 2012. Yes.
I haven't yet moved to panels. but
But
been giving serious thought to it, and I suspect that quite a few people are starting to think that that's the way to go. I've been waiting for a practical way to store the energy in the house, and I've recently seen some of that technology develop. So it may be that that many of us at a reasonable cost will be able to get off the grid altogether and store the energy that the solar panels accumulate during the day. It's interesting how fast things are changing. Keith.
Yeah, g'day, Edward. I'm from Melbourne too, so we're well represented down under. Colin Twiggs, I don't know whether you know him or not, but he's a commentator. He puts out a newsletter. His latest newsletter has caused me a bit of to prick my ears up, because he says he's got 4 indicators which show there's a coming recession and or a bear market, and one of them was oil prices, and he reckons because oil prices is going down, this points to a recession. I would have thought oil prices would have bumped the economy up because everything's a lot cheaper, but I've heard that quite a lot of times before. So what do you think?
I think Phil Anderson would have a better answer for you than I do. Phil?
Yeah, I know him very well. I've been a member of his group for many years. Yeah.
Obviously the major oil companies are experiencing windfall profits right now. And the question is, what are they doing with those windfall profits? Are they putting some of that money into investments into sustainable energy, into solar and wind, or are they simply, putting it out in dividends and in higher compensation to their executives? So, it's a cost to some people and it's revenue to others. So I think my view has been, it continues to be, Phil would probably disagree with me to some degree, that the stock market is a giant gambling casino. And I don't really see all that. I don't see fundamentals, but I do understand Phil's perspective in the sense that markets for equities and bonds and commodities all have a cyclical character that's been measured over time to be repetitive. And I'm not really going to discuss that in this course because this is not an investment advisory course. But for those of you who are looking for insight into how to manage your investments based on an understanding of economic cycles and market cycles, I suggest that you take a look at Phil's service and maybe consider becoming a subscriber. Charlie.
Yes, hi Edward, how are you?
Another Australian accent.
Yeah, another one from Melbourne too.
What time is it? What time is it there?
I started 8:30 in the morning for.
Okay. You're all wide awake and raring to go.
Yeah, that's it. Just a quick one to touch on refinancing, because down here we don't have the ability to lock in for 30 years for a home loan, and there are many people that will come off their fixed rate, which is below 2%, and probably onto higher sort of the 4 or 5% rate. So what effect do you think that will have compared to you guys when a lot of people come off that sort of lower rate and have to sort of fork out the money to pay these higher interest rates among the cost of living as well?
Well, I don't know what your secondary market is. If you have an entity that was similar to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that I worked for Fannie Mae, and so we had a secondary market for more residential mortgage loans that were originated. If you have an equivalent in Australia, the question is, what are they going to do to stimulate transaction activity? So there are a number of things you can do to offset increasing rates of interest. One is that you can loosen creditworthiness criteria. And if you do that, there's risk. I don't know who came up with this statement, but somebody long ago said that even when interest rates are going up for home mortgage loans, home prices, property prices are sticky downward. So it takes, even though there will be a decline in the number of people who are able to afford to carry the debt on the new interest rates,
Yep.
that people who are in the market to sell their property are reluctant to reduce their price because the new price levels have gotten built into the market. So unless people have a real serious need to sell their property, they'll probably pull their property off the market and just sit and wait and hope that prices go back up and the interest rates come back down.
Yeah. Thanks for the answer.
Okay, well, that takes us right to this whole discussion of the residential properties markets. And, my argument is that these markets are inherently credit fueled and speculation driven, and that leads to crashes. It puts enormous stress on economies at the top end of the economic cycle. So in the United States, it led to the cyclical crash in 2007, and that crash was repeated. I mean, it's been repeated over the decades, and we're getting set for this to happen again. Now, this chart here has an interesting bit of insight into what happened in the United States as well, because we had a crash, but new construction didn't stop. It obviously went way down. As you can see, the home building numbers went way down, but fairly quickly, 2009, 2010 started to climb back up again. And they've been climbing upward ever since. Just to give you an idea of where it's happening, 7 of the top 10 metropolitan areas with the most housing construction are in the southern part of the United States. 3 of them are in Texas. And the regions that were hardest hit by the crash were those where there was a high percentage of mortgage loans made under subprime conditions. And the subprime lenders targeted seniors, targeted low-income individuals, and a lot of those loans were fraudulently originated. And the extent of fraud that occurred in the United States in 2007 was really one of the triggers. I'm not saying there wouldn't have been a contraction, but the extent to which the subprime mortgage market was infested by fraud and misrepresentation and crime really, in my view, triggered the more serious part of the collapse. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The question is that going to happen again? Have our regulators stepped in with enough controls to prevent that from happening again? And so one leading indicator of where we are and where we're going is what is the extent to which the subprime lending arena has recovered? How many people are still using subprime mortgage loans or subprime automobile loans or subprime installment credit loans, et cetera? And that will have an impact. Now, take a look at this. This is just a chart, a graph I found. It shows, that we are a mixed economy, and so government has had a major role in helping to manage the economy ever since the Great Depression. And so we have all these safeguards that have been put into place since the New Deal, and yet we've still had 11, now 12 recessionary contractions since the end of the Second World War in the United States. So the record, it suggests to many people that we've learned how to use legislation and regulation, as well as fiscal and monetary tools, to prevent long-term systemic contractions. But I would say more accurately that once the contraction occurs, government takes whatever level of corrective action is deemed necessary to lessen the depth and the duration of even a depression-like contraction. So what it suggests to me is that our economic policy people still don't know what causes these things to happen, cannot accurately forecast them, but they think they have the tools that once it happens, they can mitigate the depth and duration, so they can bring the economy back up more quickly than if we adopted a more laissez-faire attitude and simply let the economy reach bottom. And in the early part of the 20th century, that was the ideal. The economists said, well, let's let these excesses get wrung out of the economy, get all the speculation out, and then the productive sector of the economy will then pick it up again. I think there are very few people who want to go through that again, because there's just too much collateral damage. When you have 25% of your working population out of work, and massive foreclosures on home ownership, massive evictions from apartments, millions of people on the road living out of their cars and tents and all that. That's not what I would think most people believe to be an appropriate outcome of public policy. So here's just another look at what the general tools are. This is what our experts understand they have as the toolbox to deal with the problems. These tools are being challenged by a broad spectrum of critics today, and the criticisms have a long history. Some people continue to yearn for a return to the time when government simply waited for the economy to self-correct. They still think that that's the right policy to take. And others continue to argue that government still lacks the tools to effectively manage the economy as needed and needs more power to intervene. Well, let's take a look at this a little bit in terms of a historical context. It all began in the United States during the year right after the end of the Second World War. The Depression and the Second World War opened the door for economists to have a much more meaningful impact on government policy. Economists were brought into the government, into many agencies and many bureaus, and they started to help develop policies that they would they believed would bring about sustainable economic growth and reduce the possibility of another Great Depression. And at the national level, the federal government, Harry Truman established the first Council of Economic Advisors, and this was the group sitting around the table. So at least economists now in 1946 and thereafter had a seat at the table, and they've had a seat at the table ever since. But as I said, there have been many critics. One that I have followed for the last 3 or 4 years is a critic from the Marxist tradition on the left. Some of you may know who he is. His name is Richard Wolff. He's at the New School in New York. He taught conventional neoclassical economics for all of his career until recently at the University of Massachusetts. And he has said, since he left the University of Massachusetts, that he was totally frustrated because he was teaching concepts that he thought in his own mind were not descriptive of the real world. And so when he came to the New School, he said, I'm going to talk about what I believe to be how the world really operates. And his ideas are influenced by Marx. And he is a strong proponent of democratic socialism, whatever that means to you. I mean, what democratic socialism means to Richard Wolff is different than what it would mean to some others on the left. Wolff argues that the system we call capitalism has to be replaced and not simply reformed. And his reason is as follows. Would someone like to volunteer to be a reader for us tonight? Anything that comes up quoted on the page? Someone with a good microphone and a good speaking voice. I heard somebody cough. Come on, guys, don't be.
I can do it if you want. I don't know if I've got the best voice, but I'll read.
Okay, who is that?
Charlie.
Okay, Charlie, go ahead. You're on.
So wherever capitalism has settled in the world, it has a crash on average every 4 to 7 years. Some are short and shallow, others are long and deep.
And Wolff has his own explanation for why this occurs. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. But he's articulate. I would urge you, even if you are not particularly enamored by what those on the left have to say, to at least give him a listen. What systematic changes would he ask for? Well, he believes in cooperation and cooperative enterprise. So he would like to see cooperative enterprise be encouraged by the state. He's not an advocate of central planning or state socialism at all. He wants to see a better balance between property rights and human rights. And that's an objective that I share, and I would hope that all of you share as well. So he's looked at the history of cooperatives and what they're doing now in the United States and in other societies. In the US right now, there are 30,000 cooperatives. They have an estimated revenue of $154 billion a year, and they employ about 2.1 million people. Now, that's a small part of the economy. How do you get it up to scale? Well, there are plenty of ideas. And Wolff looks at the example in Spain of the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation for instruction of what's possible. And here's what he has to say about Mondragon. It gives you a little bit of a history of it. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yep. So Mondragon started in 1956. A Roman Catholic priest named Father Arismendi gave this sermon about not waiting for someone to come in and give everyone in Mondragon a job. It started with 6 people, and today there are more than 10,000 workers and dozens of co-ops within the corporation.
Okay, and he continues.
They do everything, manufacturing, services. They maintain, by the way, their own university. They have their own bank. They also produce food on farms. You will not see giving huge salary packages to a half a dozen executives at the top, while the average worker in the establishment cannot pay for their kid to go to college without taking crippling loans. And what Richard Wolff is saying, why can't we do this all over the world? Why can't this be replicated, in every society? And that's part of what his agenda is politically, is trying to encourage government and the government in the United States to give cooperative enterprises an advantage in the legal system and the policy system and the tax system over the corporate entities. Plenty of people have really taken notice about cooperatives long before Wolff. Here's one image I found on the internet of how workers and farmers have been, operating co-ops for a very, very long time. So what is it about Wolff that is important? Well, in my mind, it's because he has the academic credentials with which to gain a seat at the table.
in order to challenge long-standing economic theories and teachings, and he's not easily dismissed. He has a large and growing following. An average of about 1.5 million people listen to his lectures and his podcasts on a regular basis. Some years ago, he was actually interviewed by Andrew Mazzoni, who was president of the Henry George School, on the School Smart Talk program. And I've been trying to get him to come back for a follow-up interview, but so far we just haven't been able to get him because the guy is in that much of a demand. One doesn't have to agree with everything he has to say, but he and others on the left realized that state socialism was a failure. It certainly has some merits in terms of the concern for human rights and to try to deal with the excesses of the capitalist system as we describe it today. Whether or not we can reform capitalism or does it have to be replaced, that's a discussion that we won't be able to get into too much, but toward the end of this course, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on it because the Henry George School has a view about change that I think describes a different systemic outcome than what we call capitalism. In fact, it's arguable that we've never experienced capitalism. If by the definition of capitalism would say it's a system, the overwhelming majority of people derive some portion, significant portion of their income from the ownership of capital goods. That's never existed. So by that definition, I would argue we've never experienced capitalism. We've always experienced some form of landlordism with the market system attached to it. Now, there are other critics. What economics professors are facing more and more frequently in their classroom is questions from students who wonder about the legitimacy of what's being taught in the classroom. There's this international network of students, academics, and professionals that it's called Rethinking Economics that are calling for fundamental changes. And here's what they have to say about the current state of teaching. Charlie, go ahead.
Yep. So economics is narrow. Sorry, economics in universities are narrow, uncritical, and detached from the real world. It is taught from one perspective as if it is the only legitimate way to study the economy. There is no room for the critical discussion and debate that is essential for any student to engage with real world economic problems.
Well, I don't think we can really argue much about that. I mean, ever since the 2008 crash, economics professors have sort of been on the defensive, and there's been a lot of discussion. And I think from what I've read, some changes in what's being taught in the classroom. How much, can you teach old dogs new tricks? When people have come to a point in their professional lives where they developed a sense of expertise, is it possible to convince them that somewhere along the line they've missed some very fundamental aspects of their discipline? Whether that's, economics, sociology, or, brain surgery. So it's a question of how open-minded some of those who are teaching economics can be to take a second look at what they've been teaching and how relevant it is to the current, economic climate. Maybe if those of you who have any children or grandchildren in college these days can talk to them and find out if they're taking economics, whether or not there's been any discussion about real world phenomena and whether they're having those kinds of discussions in their class. Okay, well, traditionally, look, the most used definition of economics as a discipline is that it is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Just like, and this simple graph, shows that we have choices. This is what neoclassical economists teaching says. We have choices. Some choices we make are rational. And so rational choice economists believe that we make, on the whole, rational choices depending upon what our situation is and what the scarcity is of our assets versus what we're seeking to produce or consume. Well, importantly, I think one must ask whether economic instability occurs because the input from economists is in important respects ignored for reasons of political necessity or ideological bias. And that's certainly, in my view, the case. Economists may have a seat at the table, but if the President of the United States has a fixed view of how the world works, it's inconsistent with what the economists are saying, then their input is going to be ignored. Or, on the other hand, is some or much of the input from economists simply wrong? And the evidence, I think, suggests, because we've had continuing cycles of boom and bust with inability of economists, by and large, with some exceptions, to forecast what is coming over the horizon, that we have both sides of the problem. We have, we have political leaders who are ignorant of reality, and we have economists who have a false sense of reality. So we'll see, whether or not things can change between now and 2026. Is there going to be any willingness to really dig deeper into what causes economic cycles, and learn what causes them, and then take the steps to mitigate or prevent them from recurring? I'm hopeful, I guess, but based on my current reading every day of what's coming out of the economics community, whether on the left or on the right, or from government, I'm not optimistic. But there is a major concern now, of course, with what's happening in the world, the global economy, and particularly with the effect of climate change. And most recently, the World Economic Forum, which is not known for being an advocate of progressive social policy changes. They're finally taking notice that of the major problems that we have. And you have, if you've ever watched the forum, there's more and more frequently spokespersons from outside the mainstream communities, and nonprofits, NGOs, other kind of activist organizations that are getting a seat at the table. And so their current agenda is called Agenda in Focus, Fixing Inequality. Just how serious this initiative is, I think we'll learn. How much of these people really understand is also another concern. The state of our reality is described by them in this way. I got a couple of slides for you, Charlie, to read. Okay, and here's what they're saying.
The global economy is not working well enough for enough people. Right now, just 1% of the world's population holds over 35% of all private wealth, more than the bottom 95% combined. No news to there. What is their agenda? Do they have any ideas of how to solve this problem? Okay, there's more information they're providing. So according to Oxfam, the 8 wealthiest individuals in the world, all men, have the same wealth as 3.6 billion of the world's poorest. The world could see its first trillionaire in the next 25 years, yet 1 in 9 people go to bed hungry every night, and 1 in 10 of us still earns less than $2 a day.
Let me stop here for a few minutes. I'd like some reactions to that. You know, when you hear these statistics, what does it make you feel about the state of, well, you know, your own society? If you're not in the United States, if you're an American, of the United States, but of the world situation.
Edward, it's absolutely disgraceful. It makes me ashamed, really, of our government, of our society. We live in an absolutely marvelous country in Australia. I mean, we've got all the wealth. It's a first world country, yet people complain when they talk about, oh, why should we give overseas aid? Well, you have to give it because it's the right thing to do. That's all I've got to say.
And Australia has a relatively small population compared to its wealth base, right? Yeah, what are you, about 35 million?
25,
Yeah.
26.
Yeah,
25.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there should, based on that alone, I would think that there's no reason why anyone in Australia should not have a sufficient access to the goods of a decent human existence. Charlie?
Yeah, look, this reminds me of a study. I can't remember the gentleman who done it, but he studied sort of our commodity export and our produce that goes out of the country. And if the government took control of that, they could basically cover all taxes paid by taxpayers and be in surplus every year if it wasn't privatized. So it's obviously, to me, like a lot of corruption. Obviously, when money's involved, people get greedy, and that's just, I guess, the rest of the world works as well.
Yeah. If we understood what just law should be, and adopted just law and then justly enforced that law, the outcomes would certainly be different. But we don't agree on what just law is. And again, I think part of it is this inability to reconcile the rightful balance between rights in property and human rights. And we're still struggling to get there. Maybe the World Economic Forum will stimulate some movement in the right direction, but it's a sad circumstance that we've had, basically almost a century to try to figure this out, and we're nowhere closer than we were when the last depression, the Great Depression, hit. Victor, how are you?
I'm okay. Interesting presentation. For me, the underlying issue is not capitalism, it's oligarchy, which is the underlying form behind both fascism and communism. In other words, if Thomas, in the United States, we have a written constitution. The 15 Commonwealth realms, including Australia and Canada and others, to this day do not have a written constitution. And I think Thomas Paine would say that even the idea of corporations are contrary to our system. In other words, charters do not give rights, they take rights away. And the founders of our Constitution were against corporations, which are the underlying form of oligarchy. That's oligarchy weaponized.
Yeah, well, to try to put the genie back in the bottle, we have to go back to mercantilism and the British Empire. We have friends from Australia on. I don't know if anyone has stayed up late enough to be here from the UK or Ireland, but the generations have gone by where we've had the same basic economic institutions that were created by the British Empire at a time when it granted monopoly privileges to these early corporate forms of ownership. And I think, and again, that's what Richard Wolff is trying to deal with, Victor, in terms of promoting cooperative enterprise to prevent oligopoly. So it's a big part of the challenge. And will it take? I mean, well, what will it take to bring about change? What kind of global movement would it take to eliminate oligarchy and to bring these societies to come up with written constitutions that actually guarantee human rights in their full breadth? Even the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations is insufficient. It does not guarantee the protection of anyone to access to the planet. You have no right to live on the planet under the UN Declaration, and in most societies, that's the same problem. Tom. Tom, you're muted.
Yes, sorry. I had to unmute. Yeah, no, I think that the previous speaker had a very interesting point that, that the oligarchy is really what is really kind of the end result. And I think that's what basically Marx was trying to say about capitalism, is that the owners of capital, because capitalism was very different than any other economic system that ever emerged. Even in the Middle Ages, you had the Catholic Church and you had aristocrats and nobles who all had obligations to the people to protect the people and provide certain services and services for the poor. Capitalism was the first dominant economic system that had no inherent moral or ethical obligations. And so the accumulation of capital and the inevitable oligarchy that would emerge between the banks, and we've seen this in the United States over and over in the Gilded Age and again in the 1920s, where capitalism left unchecked results in fewer and fewer people getting the resources needed to create businesses and have businesses and this massive wealth and income inequality. And both times it was the government that stepped in the Progressive era, and then after the we dealt with it in the interesting thing is we dealt with it in the Progressive era and we avoided a crisis. We didn't deal with it in the 1920s, and it took the Great Depression for us to bring in Roosevelt and then the New Deal, which started to address some of these issues.
Well, I won't get into a discussion of how well we dealt with it in the so-called progressive era. It depends on what decade you're talking about, but there were certain reforms in the system during the years when, for example, Henry George was alive, and the movement he started, the single tax movement, was still growing up until 1920s. But I think the important point you made was made also last couple of years by Fred Harrison. He produced a short documentary film on Magna Carta, and what he pointed out in that film was that we think of Magna Carta as the beginning of democracy. What Magna Carta was the end of reciprocity, the breakdown of the feudal obligations between those who held land in trust and those who worked the land. And so again, I mean, the victors rewrite history, and with regard to that period of time, land and natural resources became a commodity to be bought, sold, and mortgaged, and the rest is history. Peter.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I just wanted to piggyback on Tom's comment. And that capitalism, I know you just made your point about the Magna Carta, but really there's a huge difference between society during the Middle Ages and society in the 19th century and 20th century. I mean, capitalism, at least as, I guess I'll say as Marx saw it, was a system, like Tom said, where the owners of capital in the two-factor sense were completely divorced from the rest of society, in the sense that they were the owners and everybody who wasn't an owner was a non-owner.
Yeah.
And so, that kind of almost you could say schizophrenic or psychotic kind of social makeup, social construction, is doomed to abuses of humanity that we've seen in the last 200 years. So, the government is there to serve capital, the two-factor sense of capital. It's not there to serve people. If so, there are so many more people than there are owners of what people need to survive. There are so many more people in the world that, of course, something good would have happened. I know we had a little, kind of glimmer of hope during the New Deal, but it's pretty obvious that that was done just to keep people at bay. And as soon as things swung in the favor of capital once again, the two-factor sense of capital, the New Deal was undone.
Yeah, Peter,
So-
I'm not quite that cynical. And later on in the course, I'll go through the New Deal and some of its the perspectives that Roosevelt brought to the table, and also one of the key individuals that hardly anyone ever talks about, who was pivotal in the New Deal era, and that's Mariner Eccles,
Sure.
who was a federal chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to I don't want to challenge you in a sense that things were far from perfect. And there's always been an instinct to do better. And some people have acquired sufficient power to prevent those who want to do better from being successful. So we've had these cycles of improvement in the condition of human life. And then we've had, downturns that have been caused by war, by famine, by somehow the ability of people with ultra greed to take power over societies and maintain that power until there's a revolution or an uprising. I mean, I think the number is from 1800 until 1960, there was something like 2,000 uprisings in the world, all around the world. How many of them were successful? Well, not very many.
Right.
But eventually people couldn't take it anymore and decided, if I have to live like this, I might as well die trying to change things. So where we are in that kind of a position, expecting change, well, it's unfortunate that we don't seem to be able to fully come to grips with the causes of the problem and address them rationally. But maybe with some of the individuals in the world that have sufficient financial wealth and power finally realizing that something systemic has to change, that maybe they'll use their influence to allow change to occur. I don't know, but I would say that I'm hopeful, and I'm looking at what's happening with this World Economic Forum in Davos as at least an opening of the door. But
Well, the World Economic Forum it's a platform for propaganda, where the people who control pretty much everything kind of advertise themselves.
yeah,
So, I mean, why would they want to make their lives miserable and our lives better? Because capitalism is a zero-sum relationship.
well,
There's no win-win in capitalism. I know Henry George's capitalism is a win-win, but we don't have that. So, you know, I'm only speaking about what we have, not what we wish we had. So, you know, we live in a win-lose world. And if you're on the winning side of the ticket, the last thing you're going to do is give a little, unless you're forced to, which is what the 1930s was all about. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be.
No,
I don't want to.
As a student of history, I think you're right. The question is, have we matured? You know, as a species, do we have the potential to make the decisions to change? Right. I don't think we did up until recently, and now climate change is such a powerful potential impact on the entire world that even those who have enormous assets, they aren't safe. There's no safe place to go.
Right. Well, they're in other words, you're arguing that they're going to be forced to make changes, but the force is going to be exogenous, so to speak, just as it would be if a revolution were to occur. So whether it's pitchforks and machine guns, or it's, you know, climate warming or what have you, you know, you can't rely on the people who have the sweet end of the lollipop to give you some, you know, they're not going to do it.
Well, I've become a teacher, and my hope is that this kind of a discussion, which is many of these discussions are going on right now, you know, all around the world. There are many thoughtful, concerned people engaging in this kind of discussion to try to figure out what the heck is wrong and how do we get beyond it.
Yeah,
whether or not the perspectives that I'm bringing will ever find a larger audience, I don't know, but I'm at least putting the ideas out there, whether or not people agree with them or not. You know,
no, you should. You're doing a great job. I mean,
so well,
I'll let you go. I'm sorry.
The first thing what I wanted to say is, if by some chance I was invited to speak to those that are assembled at the World Economic Forum on this cause of wealth inequality, I would start with some basic insights from various analysts that describe the world in which we actually live. Try to get away from neoclassical economic theory as it's been taught. And here's one small lesson I would present to them and try to explain its importance. And this is what when I teach an introductory course in political economy, this is something that I try to present to get people just a very simple way to understand one of the basic things that's wrong with how we do things. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this piece of the Cartesian coordinate system. This is just a graph that says, okay, on one axis is supply and on another axis is demand. And when the price of a good goes up, the supply generally will increase and the demand will decrease. So when prices come down, people want more, demand more, but the supply will fall. And at some point, the equilibrium point is where everybody's happy. Now, one of the things that is important to understand is that heterodox economists are arguing that there's no such thing as an equilibrium. And there are a whole kinds of reasons why this is such a simplified view of how markets work. I would just offer one, and that is, think about all of the secondary markets for goods. You know, what happens to unsold inventories? Well, they find a price level that someone, the dollar store, is willing to say back up against a tasty cake factory and say, I'll take, you know, you're selling all of these for 25 cents a piece to a supermarket. I'll take all of your excess supply for a dime. So, you know, there's multiple markets going on at the same time. What's the real equilibrium price for that? Is it the average price? So there's a lot of microeconomic analysis that if I was a student now in a class, I would be driving my economics professor crazy, because I would be raising all these issues of how does this describe reality? Okay, well, what is one reality that we can talk about? I'm taking the same graph and I'm changing it to talk about an asset with an inelastic supply, nature. So the supply curve for nature is vertical. Why? Because you can't make any. We can achieve a lot of increase in output per unit of input, but we cannot increase the natural resources out of which everything comes. So the supply curve for nature is inelastic, and it has to be graphed as a vertical line on the chart. What the chart doesn't show, however, is that in the real world, under existing tax regimes, as demand for nature, for what in economics we still call land, as it increases and the price people are willing to pay for the control of land increases, the supply curve for land does something weird. It leans to the left. And how do you understand this? It's simple. It pays people not to bring their land that they hold to market when prices are increasing. And in that sense, rising prices for land stimulate the hoarding of land and the acquisition of land for purely speculative purposes. And therefore, the supply brought to the market is going to decline over time, drive up prices for the existing land that is brought to the market, and those increasing prices are going to make their way through the entire economy until it gets to a point where speculation and hoarding of land and natural resources so stresses the economy that consumers can no longer afford to purchase a residential property or even afford to live in an apartment, and business profit margins become so slight or disappear that businesses go out of business and we have a crash. And that's the insight that I would bring. And it's a fairly simple presentation, but it has a lot of examples in reality. And this photograph is a perfect example of how the market operates as it is currently structured. Just think for a few seconds what will happen to the asking price of building lots in the city if lots held vacant for years or decades are then released. If this person who owns this lot, their annual tax obligation is low enough that they feel comfortable just letting it sit there undeveloped and waiting for the market to ripen, or perhaps it'll never ripen. And every city that you can think of has all of these vacant lots between buildings, and sometimes vacant buildings next to them. There's a lot of discussion about what to do about it, but not much discussion among many economics professors or even policy people, the planning community. They do not understand land markets. And that's what I would try to show them with that simple graph that I just had up on the screen. Jim Frederickson, I think you have a question or comment. You're on mute, Jim.
There's a study that supports the point of view you were just enunciating from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard by graduate student Peter Ganong and Professor Daniel Shog at the Kennedy School of Government. They, in a 2017 report, they said the past 30 years have seen a dramatic decline in the rate of income convergence across states and in population flows to high income places. These changes coincide with a disproportionate increase in housing prices in high income areas. I'm sure that what they mean by housing is land.
Well, my comment would be more complicated than we have time for. But I mean, but every city has somewhere, I think the statistic is between 15 and 30% of its land area vacant or under improved. And Henry George's analysis is right on, spot on, that the primary cause of this is the undertaxation of land values and the gross overtaxation of property improvements. And, you know, this has to change if we're going to solve the problem of booms and busts in the economic cycle. That's a fundamental argument that I think has to be made, and it has to be made over and over again whenever we have the opportunity to make it, to force the people who are in policy making positions to at least look at this, look at the economic issues, the economic theory and its correctness in the real world. Joe.
Great presentation as always. I can't, your logic is undeniable. The other aspects of it, though, I think for a lot of people maybe need a bit of clarification.
I'm sure it does.
If we if we get people to if this process were enacted, I think perhaps a nice, simple, direct measure in addition would be rent controls to ensure that the landowners who held onto their property were not charging what the market will bear, and maybe inclusionary zoning for the same reason. That puts downward pressure on the land prices, and all of those things. I mean, it seems to me, this has been mentioned before, that there's a lot of arrows in the quiver we could be using, and in particularly the rent control, I think, is something that is persuasive to a lot of citizens. And the rent control is sort of like another dampener of land properties too, right? And if the land does stay down and people don't develop, which has often been a criticism of rent controls, then the government can buy up the cheaper land and put up housing.
Well, the measures you're talking about, and I've supported inclusionary zoning. I've supported community land trusts. That was a focus of my work at Fannie Mae. These are all Band-Aids. They're short-run mitigations that have unforeseen consequences. Rent control, rent control in buildings that age puts enormous financial pressure on the owner. Particularly if it's an owner that is looking for other than social recognition. If they're looking for profit, then as the building ages, the rents have to be adjusted based on the cost of maintaining the buildings and giving the owner a comparatively market rate of return. So if I own a building that's rent controlled and my net return after all my expenses is 2%, why would I not dump that building and put my money into something where there's more opportunity to gain a much better rate of return on my investment? The public can step in, of course, and subsidize the construction of affordable housing units and do so with, tax revenue. The ideal, of course, would be that revenue came from an increased tax on the value of land and other natural assets. So I'm not really at this point very enthusiastic of more Band-Aids because they've only mitigated the problem and hidden the systemic part of the problem.
Well, okay, so
we have to provide housing for people in the interim. We have to provide housing for people who are now in substandard housing, living in tents or under bridges or homeless.
So, okay, so let me just ask then, how are you going to prevent people from hanging on to their properties and renting at whatever the market will bear.
Can I make a comment here, please?
Okay.
Whenever I hear people talk about rent control, I wonder, why do they hate tenants? They must hate them. Paul Keating tried rent control. Sorry, not rent control. Same thing. He tried. He abolished negative gearing. As soon as he did that, rents went up because people sold their investment properties. When they have rent control, landlords won't stand for it, and they get out of the market. The few that remain, the rents go through the roof. So people that want these measures don't understand it hurts the tenant, and it hurts them badly.
The better option, in my view, for public policy is for either the conversion of apartment buildings into limited equity co-ops, which are then, controlled by the former tenants who are now shareholders in the cooperative enterprise, and they manage the building for themselves. And by a restriction on resale price, those units are kept affordable and perpetually. So I think limited equity co-op conversions is a much better strategy than rent control or rent stabilization even.
I think those are all good ideas, and I understand what Keith is saying, but still you would have, in a large city, you would have thousands of units being rented and nothing to stop the owner from charging what the market will bear. And of course, that is capturing economic rent. And there has to be a way of, capturing the economic rent that the owner is taking in.
All I can tell you, Joe, is that in my 20 years of working on affordable housing initiatives, the best solutions were always establishing housing opportunities that had some sort of deed restriction on resale, eligibility for mortgage financing limited to households with a lower household income. The problem is we never could get to the number of units necessary to meet the demand.
Right.
And in the United States, at least, because of the age of the housing stock, every year 2 units came out of the housing stock for every 1 unit that was constructed or renovated. So we have a declining housing supply because of the aging housing stock in many towns and cities across the United States. So it's a major challenge, and other than direct government subsidy, I don't see how the market can solve it until we get to a point where we move in the direction of Henry George's design for societal collection of economic rent, and move away from the taxation of property improvements altogether. I don't think I find no logic in imposing an annual tax on assets that depreciate, and housing units are one of the most important personal assets that people have, and to impose an annual tax on top of the fact that it costs a lot of money every year for maintenance, and then every 10 years you have to spend a lot of money or borrow a lot of money from the banks in order to do systems replacement. So we have to make that case.
I was assuming those 2 changes you just mentioned. And I was just saying, even if you made those 2 changes, it seems to me you would have landlords renting what the market will bear.
Well, if we make those changes, I wouldn't care. But in the meantime, we do
Well,
have.
why wouldn't you care if the landlords are charging what the market?
Because supply will eventually increase to a point where the landlords cannot, charge more than an average rate of return.
Okay, I see.
Peter, I think you were next for a comment.
Yeah, hi. I think I don't remember the details. I'm sorry, but Vienna, Austria has great policies for housing, public housing, and so forth. I don't know if there's any George's component to it. But you know, people can pay as low as 10% of their income towards very beautiful, high quality housing. I think the average for assisted housing is more like 25% of income. But yeah, if you guys, just YouTube, search it on YouTube. You don't have to get technical or academic about it. Just go to YouTube and you'll see people, architects and engineers, talking about the projects they've worked on in Vienna and so forth.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, obviously what you have to look at is who owns the property and where is the money coming to maintain it. If you're only charging people a low monthly rent, then the question is how much can go out of that rent could go into a reserve for replacement, systems replacement and maintenance. So I mean, in the general percentage that in the United States, there's an organization that tracks expenses, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and their argument is no one should pay more than 30% of their gross monthly income for housing, and then it becomes unaffordable. And we have many people now who are paying 50 or 60%, and as properties are converted, like for example, there's been a lot of discussion about the most affordable type of housing in the United States for many decades has been mobile homes or manufacturing homes located in a mobile home park where the owner is charging them ground rents. And so a lot of these mobile home parks are being sold to investors, and they're immediately raising the ground rents to a level that people can't afford. And the people who own the units can't afford to pay the cost to have the units hauled away. And so they simply have to abandon them. So it's a terrible situation.
I know in New York City, I teach math to adult workers who are mostly home health aides, people who look after your grandparents and so forth. And, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but a great many of them live in one bedroom of somebody else's house. Yep. You know, they don't have their own place. And this has been the case for decades. So it's not a new phenomenon. No, I mean, it's always in metropolitan New York, you have such an influx of population increasing and neighborhood turnover all the time. We used to struggle with financing properties that had illegal apartments, you know, in Brooklyn, for example. And if anyone lives in Brooklyn, you probably know this, that, you know, every house that had a garage had the garage was turned into a basement that provided additional income to the owners. And every legal 2-unit property probably had an illegal 3rd unit, and every 3-unit property had an illegal 4th unit, et cetera, all the way. And that was just, just because there was a shortage of affordable housing. The only thing that caused a real problem was gentrification. When higher income households started to buy these properties back, they started to complain about the fact that there were so many cars on the streets because people still had automobiles for all these illegal units. And so there's always been, the conflict, not in my backyard, or, what's the practical solution to these problems if you can't find the land on which to construct new affordable housing units. As I was discussing with Joe, in my view, it's only the ideas advocated by Henry George and those who embrace his ideas that are systemic in nature. Everything else is a Band-Aid that will
eventually not solve the problem. And and the problem can often get worse based on declining, economic conditions. When we get into we get deeper into this recession, if it turns into a recession where jobs are lost, what is going to be the public response when more and more people can no longer find the money to pay the rents that are being demanded by apartment unit owners? We're almost out of time tonight. We covered a fair amount of ground. I want to leave you with this sort of additional analysis to think about, as Henry George would ask us to think about, what broadly belongs to the definition of land. It's not just parcels of land in cities and towns. There's heavy speculation in land and all natural assets that have an inelastic supply. And I argue that history tells us that this is a primary cause of market collapse, of recessions, and worse. And this is just a partial list of some of the most important natural assets that have a vigorous market and attract intense speculation. So start off with our locations in our towns and cities, tracts with forests or subsurface minerals, agricultural land, fish in the oceans, lakes, streams, and rivers. There's concern about us, taking all of the fishing out of the ocean. Well, what should we do? It's in order to preserve it, we have to limit the extraction of these resources. How do we allocate licenses to allocate to fish in the oceans or extract resources? Frequencies on the broadcast spectrum, should they ever be sold outright? Well, you selling an asset outright, you do get revenue, but then your revenue stream ends unless you're imposing an annual tax on the value of those frequencies that are sold. Routes around the Earth for satellites. There's only so much room up there in outer space, and some routes around the planet are more valuable than others because of who is being broadcasted to. So how should we allocate those routes? No one's paying for those privileges now. And then the one I think is really interesting is what we do with takeoff and landing slots at airports. No two airplanes can occupy the same place at the same time without pretty disastrous consequences. How do we ration off those slots? Well, right now we're not doing it by an auction system. At least not that I'm aware of in any reading that I've done. But think about your own travel. What time would you prefer to take a plane from your origins to where your destination is? Probably 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning would be nice, but 2 o'clock in the morning, not so much. So 8 or 9 o'clock takeoff slots is worth a whole lot more to the airline that has that slot than a 2 a.m. slot. In the same way with landing slots, would like to get home at a reasonable hour. Get home at 4 a.m. in the morning. That slot for landing should be certainly less valuable than a landing at 7 p.m. or something like that. All of these natural assets have a market value based on competitive bidding if we just created those markets. And how much revenue would that yield if these and other natural assets were made available on the basis of competitive bidding on an annual basis as a starting point for how we would raise revenue for government? And then what would that do for economic stability and sustainable economic development? Douglas.
Yes, you mentioned natural resources that with any elastic supply. I take the example of bluefin tuna in the ocean. One tuna sold for over $1 million. So the supply of bluefin tuna drops dramatically as the price increases. That's my comment.
Yeah. So some scientists, someone knows the rate of increase in tuna population versus the extraction of tuna, and how many are left in the ocean, and what you need as a stock to produce the next generation. So licenses to extract tuna, how should they be awarded? Theory suggests that they should be awarded on a competitive bidding basis. You tell all the fishermen in the world, we can only extract 1 million tuna from the ocean every year. So we're going to issue licenses for each, how many licenses we can issue to extract that 1 million tuna, and whatever you think you can afford to pay in rent is what the market will bear, and then no more licenses will be issued after that.
They try that, but there's a lot of cheating going on.
Yeah. Well, that's just law, justly enforced. And
okay, enjoy your class. Thank you very much.
Now we're getting to question, about how to reform the political system, and I hope to get to some of those issues, because I don't want to be the guy who says all he did was bring up all the problems, but didn't offer very many solutions. Not that the solutions that I've come to are the absolute right ones, but I've tried to give it a fair amount of thought, and hopefully what I have to say during the course will give you food for thought, and maybe some of you will agree with some of what I put forward.
Edward, one of the versions of property you didn't mention, which is big in Australia at the moment, is the property over the airspace over buildings. You can actually buy that, and some people buy the airspace over adjoining buildings so they can't get built out.
So, for example, the practical implications, let's say you have a 4-story building and you purchase the air rights over that building so that a new owner of the building could not build additional floors or stories.
You can, but you can buy the air rights over the adjoining building next door, so they can't go up higher and block out your view.
Right. Yeah. There are all sorts of market anomalies based on what we permit to happen. Whether or not that makes sense, I don't know. There are plenty of people who don't believe in zoning or height restrictions or setback requirements or other building codes. In the United States, I think the large city that has no zoning is Houston. And the people in Houston seem to be okay with it, but Houston is a very sprawling city as well. But practically all the cities in the United States are sprawling. We do not have the kind of growth, boundaries here very often. I guess Portland is one of the examples where the cities have established growth boundaries, but then the land inside the growth boundary has skyrocketed in value as well, because you've artificially reduced the supply and made it very profitable to speculate in land in Portland within the urban growth boundaries. So speculators, I can tell you in my years of working in affordable housing development, speculators were always 1 or 2 steps ahead of us. They knew where we were going and they got there first. And so let's say, for example, that if Fannie Mae was helping to fund 100 units of affordable housing with a possibility of a second phase, maybe the land acquisition cost for that first 100 units might have been as little as a couple $1,000s per unit. By the time that first phase of 100 units were built, the speculators had come in and taken options on all the contiguous property in that area. And so the next negotiation with the landowners was multiple times, or it could have been as high as $20 or $30 or $50,000 per unit, which now means if you're going to construct a housing unit that's affordable for lower income households, you have to find the subsidy money to acquire the land and still be able to price that unit to be affordable to someone who only makes 80% of area median income. And it's very difficult to do. Douglas, you have a final comment? And if anyone else.
No, that's all.
Okay. Before we close out tonight, anyone have a final comment, question? Well, then I will turn it over to Ibrahima for any final comment he wants to make. And I thank all of you for hanging in there with me for the second lecture. And I hope to see you next Wednesday.
Great, Ed. Thank you. That was a fantastic evening. We look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday, same time. Good night.
Good night, all.